Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're interested to learn what places and times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1847 when the Caldwell estate stood proudly among the wide cotton fields of Wilkes County, Georgia. The Plantation house, with its grand white columns and wide wraparound porch, was considered the jewel of the region, sitting on a gentle hill overlooking nearly 800 acres of land. The Caldwell name carried great influence in local society, not only for their substantial wealth but also for the twin daughters who had become the subject of quiet gossip throughout the county. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, identical in appearance down to the small birthmark above their right eyebrows, had turned 22 that spring. They were well past the age when most young women of their class would have been married with children of their own. What few outside the plantation knew was that behind the perfectly maintained front of Southern gentility, a chain of events had been set in motion that would eventually tear apart the very foundation of the Caldwell legacy. According to county records uncovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952, the twins' mother had died during childbirth, leaving their father, Thomas Caldwell, to raise them alone. Thomas never remarried, devoting his life to his daughters and to expanding his cotton empire. The first sign that something was wrong at the Caldwell plantation came in the form of a letter written by the family's longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah. The letter, dated April 8, 1847, mentioned that the young missus had begun spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters, something the master seemed strangely unconcerned about. This letter would later be found tucked inside a family Bible, preserved between its pages for over a century. The quarters Margaret referred to were the slave quarters, a group of small wooden buildings located about half a mile from the main house, just beyond a stand of oak trees that hid them from view. The Caldwell plantation held around 70 enslaved individuals, a modest number compared to some nearby estates, but enough to work the land and maintain the household. Among these enslaved people were two men who would become central to the troubling events that followed. According to plantation records kept in the Georgia Historical Society archives, they were listed simply as Samuel and Elijah, both noted as having been purchased in 1842 from a South Carolina plantation that had fallen into financial trouble. What made Samuel and Elijah unusual, based on accounts gathered decades later by local historian William Hartwell, was their education. Both men had been taught to read and write by their former owners' children, a dangerous skill they carefully hid after arriving at the Caldwell plantation. This secrecy eventually failed when Catherine Caldwell discovered Samuel reading a discarded newspaper in the stables late one evening in the autumn of 1846. Instead of reporting this illegal act, Catherine, according to her personal diary recovered in 1964 during the demolition of the old plantation house, began to meet Samuel in secret. The diary entries became increasingly cryptic around this time, with references to signs in our shared understanding. At the same time, estate records show that Samuel was moved from field work to the stables, a position that gave him closer access to the main house. What official records do not clearly explain, but what local oral tradition suggests, is that Elizabeth had also formed a connection with Elijah, who worked mainly in maintaining the plantation's large gardens. The symmetry of these relationships, twin sisters forming forbidden bonds with two enslaved men, created a disturbing pattern later described by one local newspaper as a strange mirroring of forbidden affections. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was unusually severe in Georgia, with freezing temperatures that damaged cotton stores and increased isolation as roads became hard to travel. It was during these cold, lonely months that the relationships apparently deepened. A letter from Thomas Caldwell to his brother in Charleston, dated January 23, 1847, mentions his concern about a strange sadness that had overtaken Elizabeth, while Catherine seemed almost feverishly energetic. He wrote that he feared the isolation of winter had affected their temperaments in opposite ways. What Thomas failed to realize was that his daughters were not suffering from winter sadness or cabin fever. Instead, They were involved in a dangerous web of secrets and forbidden relationships that broke every social rule of their time and place. Discovery would have been devastating not only for the enslaved men who could face torture or death, but also for the Caldwell name, which would be permanently stained. The first clear evidence of the true nature of these relationships appeared in a series of coded messages found pressed between the pages of a book of poetry belonging to Elizabeth. These small notes, written on scraps of paper and dated through February 1847, appeared to contain plans for meetings and expressions of devotion. One especially revealing note read, "The usual place at midnight. The moon will be new offering cover. He says C and S will join. 4 hearts beating as 2. This suggestion that the twins were not only aware of each other's forbidden relationships but were actively planning together added a layer of shared conspiracy to the story. Rather than acting alone, the sisters seemed to be working together, their identical looks perhaps even being used to confuse and mislead anyone who might grow suspicious. The turning point came on March 15, 1847, when Thomas Caldwell announced at dinner that he had arranged marriages for both his daughters to the sons of prominent plantation owners in nearby counties. According to Catherine's diary, this announcement was met with outward calm, though she wrote, "Beneath my smile, my heart turned to stone." Elizabeth's reaction was not recorded, but later events suggest she felt the same resistance to their father's plans. 3 days after this announcement, in the early hours of March 18th, something occurred that would forever change the course of the Caldwell family history. The Plantation's overseer, James Whitaker, was awakened by what he later described in a deposition as a commotion unlike any I had heard before. When he investigated, he discovered that a small fire had been set in one of the storage buildings near the slave quarters. While the fire was quickly controlled and caused little damage, the confusion that followed revealed a far more serious problem. Samuel, Elijah, and the Caldwell twins were all missing. A search was immediately organized, with neighboring plantations alerted and search parties sent out along every road and trail leading from the Caldwell property. The first assumption recorded in Whitaker's journal was that the enslaved men had escaped and, in an act of unbelievable boldness, had abducted the Caldwell daughters. A large reward was offered for their capture, and the situation quickly grew into one of the largest manhunts in county history. Thomas Caldwell, according to those who witnessed it, became a man driven nearly mad, barely eating or sleeping as the search continued. What the search parties did not know, and what would not be discovered until much later, was that the fire had been deliberately set by Elizabeth as a distraction. This detail would come to light in 1868 when a former house servant named Ruth gave testimony to a northern journalist documenting stories of the antebellum South. According to Ruth, Elizabeth had confided in her hours before the fire, instructing her to remain silent about what she knew. The search continued for weeks, spreading into neighboring counties and eventually across state lines. During this time, Thomas Caldwell's health rapidly declined. Plantation records show that by April, he had taken to his bed, attended only by his longtime house servant and a physician from Augusta, who was called to the plantation twice. Then, on May 2, 1847, a letter arrived at the Caldwell plantation. The contents of this letter were never fully revealed in any public record, but its impact was immediate. Thomas Caldwell, after reading it, suffered what his doctor described as a violent outburst of rage followed by a collapse from which he never recovered. He died 3 days later, the cause listed simply as apoplexy, a common term at the time for what we now recognize as a stroke. After Thomas's death, control of the plantation passed to his brother, Edward Caldwell, who traveled from Charleston to take over management of the estate. During Edward's careful review of his brother's affairs, a shocking discovery was made in Thomas's private study. A small wooden box contained what appeared to be marriage certificates. These rough documents, though crudely drawn, carried signatures claiming to record the marriage of Elizabeth Caldwell to Elijah and Catherine Caldwell to Samuel on the night of March 17, 1847. The certificates were accompanied by a letter believed to be written by Catherine. In it, she explained that the twins had fallen in love with the two men and, knowing their father would never agree, had planned their escape together. The letter described months of secret preparation, saving small items and planning a journey north to states where they might live, if not openly, then at least without the constant threat of capture and forced separation. Most disturbing to Edward was the realization that his nieces had not been abducted, but had left by choice. They had willingly given up their privileged lives, the IR family name, and their entire social world for what Catherine described as the only true happiness we have ever known. The letter ended with a request that their father try to understand and forgive them, though they admitted they did not expect either. Edward Caldwell, after consulting legal advisors and family connections, made a decision that would shape how the incident would be remembered. He buried the evidence. The certificates and letter were returned to the box and sealed away. Publicly, he continued the story that his nieces had been abducted, possibly killed by escaped slaves. The search shifted, now focused more on recovering bodies than finding living people. This official story remained in place for nearly 20 years, until a development in 1865 changed everything. After the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people, a woman arrived at what remained of the Caldwell Plantation. The estate, now reduced to less than half its former size, was struggling to survive in the new economic reality. The woman identified herself as Margaret Johnson, but her resemblance to the long-missing Caldwell twins was impossible to ignore. She requested a meeting with Edward Caldwell, who still managed what was left of the property. According to household staff, the meeting lasted several hours, with raised voices sometimes heard through the closed study doors. When Margaret Johnson left, Edward Caldwell appeared deeply shaken. He spoke to no one about what was said, but soon began selling off what remained of the estate. Within 6 months, the plantation was sold, and Edward returned to Charleston, where he lived in isolation until his death in 1871. The truth of that meeting remained unknown until 1958, when a collection of letters was donated to the Georgia Historical Society by Edward's granddaughter. Among them was a detailed account of the meeting written by Edward to his wife the day after it happened. According to his letter, Margaret Johnson was indeed Catherine Caldwell, now using the surname of her husband Samuel, who had taken the name Samuel Johnson after their escape. Catherine revealed that she, Elizabeth, Elijah, and Samuel had reached Philadelphia, where they lived within a community of free black people and abolitionists who helped them create new identities. Elizabeth and Elijah, using the surname Davis, later moved further north to Boston, where Elijah found work as a carpenter. Samuel, with his experience with horses, opened a small but successful livery stable, while Catherine worked as a seamstress. They had children. Catherine and Samuel had 3. Elizabeth and Elijah also had 3, all raised without knowing their mother's true origins. Catherine had returned south only after learning that her uncle still controlled the former plantation. She hoped to recover personal belongings that had once belonged to her mother and had been left behind during their escape. More importantly, she wanted to correct the historical record, to make it known that she and her sister had not been victims, but had made a choice, a radical and dangerous choice, to follow their hearts despite overwhelming social and legal barriers. Edward, however, refused her request. In his letter, he wrote that he could not bring himself to reveal the truth, saying that the shame it would bring upon our name, and upon the memory of my broth, is too great to consider. He offered Catherine a large sum of money in exchange for her silence and her promise never to return to Georgia. Whether Catherine accepted this offer is not stated, but records show that Margaret Johnson purchased a ticket to Philadelphia the very next day and never returned to Georgia. The Caldwell family's story of tragic abduction and presumed death remained the official version. In 1883, a fire destroyed much of the Wilkes County courthouse, including many records from the antebellum period. This loss further clouded the already unclear details of the Caldwell case. By the turn of the century, the story had become a local legend, with added details and even supernatural elements layered onto what was originally a deeply human story of forbidden love and desperate decisions. It was not until 1964, during the demolition of the original Caldwell Plantation house, that Catherine's diary was discovered hidden in a small compartment built into the wall of what had once been her bedroom. The diary, covering January 1846 to March 1847, provided the first-hand account from one of the people involved. The diary revealed a complex and emotional picture of the relationships between the twins and the enslaved men. Catherine wrote of her first shock at discovering Samuel's literacy, followed by curiosity, then a deep intellectual connection, and finally love. She described long conversations about philosophy, religion, and freedom that changed how she understood the world and her place in it. Especially moving were her writings about the moral struggle she faced as she came to recognize the full humanity of a man society had taught her to see as property. "I have been blind," she wrote on November 12, 1846, "not only to the suffering around me, but to the very nature of what it means to be human. S has opened my eyes, and now I cannot close them again, though the light sometimes pains me." The diary also confirmed that the twins knew about and supported each other's relationships. Catherine described late-night talks with Elizabeth, their shared fears and hopes, and their slowly forming plan to escape. The final entry, dated March 16, 1847, reads simply, "Tomorrow we leave everything we have known for an uncertain future. We may find freedom or death, but either is better than living a lie." The discovery of the diary renewed interest in the case among historians who studied the antebellum South. Research in the 1960s uncovered more evidence, including shipping records showing passage booked for 4 people from Savannah to Philadelphia in late March 1847 under the names Johnson and Davis. Census records from Philadelphia in 1850 confirmed Samuel and Catherine Johnson listed as mulatto, living in a mostly black neighborhood with 2 children. Boston records similarly showed Elijah and Elizabeth Davis with 1 child, also identified as mulatto. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery came in 1968 when a descendant of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis contacted researchers after learning about the renewed interest in the case. This descendant, a professor at a New England university, possessed a collection of letters exchanged between the twins throughout the 1850s and 1860s. These letters painted a picture of 2 women who, despite the great sacrifices they had made, found meaning and fulfillment in the lives they had chosen. They wrote about their children, their work, their continued learning, and their involvement in abolitionist causes. They also expressed ongoing fear of being discovered, especially after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which increased the danger for everyone involved. The most revealing letter, dated July 4, 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, captured Catherine's reflection on their long journey. "Today marks not only the independence of this nation, but at long last our own true freedom. For 18 years we have lived in shadows, always looking over our shoulders. Now, though many challenges remain, we may finally step into the light. Yet, I find myself thinking of Father, wondering if in some way he might finally understand the choice we made. I like to believe that, freed from the limits of the world that shaped him, he might." By 1969, enough evidence had been gathered to significantly revise the historical understanding of what had become known as the Caldwell twins incident. What had long been described as an abduction and presumed murder was revealed to be something far more complex, a deliberate rejection of the social order by 2 young women who chose love and moral belief over family privilege and personal safety. The descendants of the Caldwell twins, now spread across the northern United States, have mostly chosen to keep their privacy. Only a few agreed to limited interviews with historians. These interviews, mainly conducted in the 1970s, revealed families who had grown up with carefully edited versions of their ancestry, usually being told that their great-grandmothers were northern women who had married men of mixed-race background. The full truth, that these women were the daughters of a Georgia plantation owner, who fell in love with enslaved men on their father's plantation, staged their own abduction and fled north to build new lives, was often not shared until adulthood, if it was shared at all. Some descendants expressed pride in their ancestors' courage, while others struggled with the difficult moral realities of a family history tied to both slave ownership and resistance to slavery. The former Caldwell Plantation has since been divided and developed, with little left to mark where these events took place. A small historical marker placed in 1972 at the nearest intersection to where the main house once stood makes only a brief reference to the historically important Caldwell family plantation, with no mention of the twins or their extraordinary story. Local views of the story have changed over time, moving from early shock and denial to a more thoughtful recognition of its importance as a rare recorded case of white Southern women actively rejecting and escaping the slave society in which they were raised. Academic interest has grown, especially among scholars studying resistance to slavery and interracial relationships in the antebellum period. What remains most powerful about the Caldwell twins' story is how it challenges simple stories about the antebellum South. It shows the possibility of personal moral awakening, even among those who benefited most from the existing system. It also shows how personal relationships could sometimes cross the strict boundaries of race and status, while reminding us how rare and dangerous such actions were. In Catherine's diary she wrote, "We did not choose to be born into this world of masters and slaves, but we can choose whether to accept it." In making their choice, the Caldwell twins left behind a legacy that still carries meaning today. It stands as proof that even in the darkest parts of human history, people can find the courage to follow their conscience, no matter the cost. Perhaps the most haunting part of the story is the silence that followed, how completely the truth was hidden, how carefully the story was controlled by those who stayed behind. It reminds us how many similar stories may have been lost, leaving us to wonder how many other acts of resistance, both large and small, were never recorded or remembered. In the end, what we know of Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, and of Samuel and Elijah, comes to us only in pieces, diary pages, letters, and official records that tell us when they were born, but not how they truly lived. Census entries confirm that they existed, but say nothing about their dreams. We are left to imagine the bravery it took to step into the night, leaving behind everything familiar for the promise of something honest and true. The plantation house where they grew up is gone. The fields where Samuel and Elijah labored have been changed by time and development. All that remains is the story itself, preserved not in grand monuments, but in archives and family memories, a quiet voice from the past that continues to ask difficult questions of the present. As for the wooden box containing those rough marriage certificates, the physical proof of that forbidden promise made on a March night in 1847, its location is still unknown. Some historians believe Edward Caldwell destroyed it before his death, unable to face what it represented. Others believe it may still exist, hidden away in some forgotten collection, waiting to be found again, much like the truth it held. The search for that truth continues not only for historians, but for all who seek to understand the full complexity of our shared past. In that search, the story of the Caldwell twins serves as a reminder that history is not only about laws, wars, and the deeds of powerful men, but also about individual hearts and minds, about small acts of courage that can sometimes change everything. In 1966, another remarkable document appeared during an estate sale in Peach, Philadelphia. A small leather-bound journal, damaged by water but mostly readable, was found inside a false bottom drawer of an antique writing desk. The journal belonged to Samuel Johnson, formerly Samuel of the Caldwell Plantation, and contained entries from 1848 to 1859. This discovery provided the first written account from one of the enslaved men involved in the escape. Samuel's journal revealed details that had not been known before about the escape plan and how it was carried out. He wrote about the careful preparation, how over many months they gathered supplies, studied maps, and memorized the routes of the Underground Railroad. Most striking, he described their journey north, a terrifying 6-week ordeal of traveling by night, hiding during the day, and depending on a network of kind people who risked their own safety to help them. One entry, dated April 2nd, 1847, described a particularly tense moment. "Today we nearly met disaster. A patrol stopped the wagon carrying us, hidden under sacks of grain. Elizabeth, despite her fear, spoke with such strength to the patrolman, saying she was traveling to visit relatives in the next county. Her voice never shook, though I could feel Catherine trembling beside me in our hiding place. When the patrol finally moved on, we dared not breathe for what felt like hours." Samuel's journal also gave insight into the complex emotions he felt during and after the escape. He wrote of guilt over leaving family members still enslaved on the Caldwell plantation, of the confusion of new freedom, and of the constant alertness required to keep their fragile safety in Philadelphia. Especially moving were his thoughts on his relationship with Catherine. In an entry from 1852, he wrote, "She sometimes speaks of what she gave up to be with me. I remind her that I know exactly what she sacrificed, perhaps even better than she does herself. There are days when I see her watching women in fine dresses from our window, and I wonder if she regrets her choice. Then she turns to me, and I see in her eyes the same strength that led her to choose this life, this freedom, this love, imperfect as it may be." The journal also showed that contact with their former home was not fully cut off after their escape. Samuel described Catherine's letters with Margaret Sullivan, the former housekeeper who had first noted the twins' unusual behavior. Margaret, who had moved to Richmond after Thomas Caldwell's death, became a quiet source of news about events in Georgia and the aftermath of the twins' disappearance. Through these letters, Catherine learned of her father's death and her uncle's control of the plantation. This information eventually led to her dangerous return to Georgia in 1865, a choice Samuel described as reckless but necessary for her peace of mind. His entry after her return suggests the meeting with Edward Caldwell did not bring the comfort Catherine had hoped for. She returned more troubled than before, carrying the heavy knowledge of her father's final days. The thought that he died believing she had been taken against her will, perhaps even killed, haunted her in a way I could not ease. In 1967, another important piece of evidence appeared when researchers found church records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Philadelphia. These records showed the baptisms of the Johnson and Davis children, with godparents listed for each. Remarkably, Elizabeth served as godmother to Catherine's first son, while Catherine was godmother to Elizabeth's daughter, showing that the sisters kept their close bond despite the hardships of their new lives. These records also showed that both families moved several times within Philadelphia and Boston, likely because of fears linked to the Fugitive Slave Act and the growing risk of capture. The pattern of moving about every 2 years points to the constant worry that must have shaped their lives during this time. By 1855, according to city directories and tax records, Samuel Johnson had built a small but successful livery business in a mainly immigrant neighborhood of Philadelphia. This business allowed the family to buy a small home, an extraordinary achievement considering they had arrived in the city just 8 years earlier, with almost nothing. Elijah and Elizabeth, meanwhile, had moved from Boston to a small farming area in western Massachusetts by 1854. Local records show Elijah worked as a carpenter and cabinet maker, while Elizabeth added to their income by teaching reading and basic math to local children. Their relative isolation in this rural setting may have given them extra safety, keeping them somewhat removed from the attention they might have faced in a large city. One of the most interesting findings came in 1968, when a researcher studying abolitionist organization records identified Catherine Johnson and Elizabeth Davis as contributors to several anti-slavery publications. Writing under false names, the sisters produced a series of anonymous letters describing the moral damage of the slave system from the view of those raised within it. These letters, published in The Liberator and other abolitionist newspapers between 1852 and 1858, never gave away the writer's true identities or exact situations, but spoke strongly about the harm slavery caused, not only to the enslaved, but also to the enslavers. In one letter believed to be written by Elizabeth, slavery was described as a poison that corrupts the soul of the master just as surely as it breaks the body of the slave, a system that makes true human connection impossible across its forced boundaries. The Civil War brought both new hope and new fear for the families. Samuel's journal entries from 1861 to 1865 show both. He wrote of sending money to support Union efforts, of attending meetings where news from the battlefields was shared, and of the community's shared anxiety about what a Confederate victory might mean for free black people in the North. A powerful entry from January 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, reads, "Today marks the beginning of what we have dreamed of for so long. Though the proclamation's practical effects may be limited, its moral meaning cannot be denied. For the first time, this nation has officially declared what we have always known to be true, that no man has the right to own another." Elizabeth and I celebrated quietly, unable to fully express what this day means to us who have lived on both sides of this terrible divide. The years after the war brought greater safety, as the legal end of slavery removed the most immediate threat. Still, census and other records suggest the families continued to live carefully, never fully sharing their pasts, even as the risk of re-enslavement slowly faded. In 1873, tragedy struck the Johnson family when Samuel died suddenly of pneumonia at about 50 years of age. His death certificate, found in Philadelphia records, lists his job as business owner and his race as colored, with no sign of his extraordinary life story. Catherine never remarried. City directories show she continued running the livery business with help from her oldest son until 1881, when she sold it and moved to live with her daughter, in upstate New York. She died there in 1890 at about 65 years of age. Elizabeth lived nearly 10 years longer, passing away in 1900 at her farm in Massachusetts, surrounded by children and grandchildren. According to family letters shared by descendants, in her later years she sometimes spoke about her youth in Georgia, though always carefully edited to leave out the most dangerous parts of her escape and new life. One of the most touching documents to come from this research was a letter Elizabeth wrote to her granddaughter on the girl's 18th birthday in 1895. In this letter, kept by the family and later given to the Massachusetts Historical Society, Elizabeth shared life advice shaped by her remarkable experiences, even though she still did not reveal their full story. "My dearest girl, as you stand at the doorway of womanhood, I wish to share with you the most important lesson my long life has taught me. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to act despite it. There will be times when you must choose between what is expected and what is right, between the easy path and the true one. In those moments, remember that the hardest choice often leads to the greatest freedom. I have known both captivity and liberty in this life, though perhaps not in the ways you might imagine, and I can tell you without doubt that no comfort or luxury is worth the cost of a compromised soul. The historical record is still incomplete in many ways. No photographs of the sisters have ever been found, though a daguerreotype believed to show Samuel and Catherine's oldest son, taken in Philadelphia around 1870, is held by the Georgia Historical Society. The young man strongly resembles descriptions of Thomas Caldwell from the time, a visible echo of the family's complicated past. In 1969, an archaeological dig at the former Caldwell Plantation site uncovered the foundations of the slave quarters and recovered several objects, including a small carved wooden bird that, according to Catherine's diary, was a gift from Samuel. This small object now sits in a museum collection, a silent reminder of a love that crossed the boundaries of its time. The story of the Caldwell twins has inspired many academic papers, several historical novels, and at least one stage play. Still, it remains mostly unknown outside scholarly circles. Perhaps this is because it challenges comfortable ideas about the antebellum South, questioning both Southern myths of kind plantation life and northern beliefs about simple moral divisions between regions. What makes the Caldwell case truly unique is not simply that it involves interracial relationships in the antebellum South. Such relationships were more common than often admitted, though usually involving white men and enslaved women, often marked by exploitation rather than free choice. What makes this case different is that it documents white Southern women who not only formed loving relationships with enslaved men, but acted on those feelings in the most radical way possible, by rejecting their privilege and fleeing with their chosen partners. In 1968, during an oral history interview, a great-granddaughter of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis reflected on her family's past. When I think about what they risked, not just comfort or status, but possibly their lives for love and for what they believed was right, it humbles me. They had the courage to look at the world they were born into and say, "No, this is wrong, and I will not be part of it," even when that decision cost them almost everything. That kind of moral courage is rare in any time. The Caldwell twins' story now exists in a space between clear history and legend. The main facts, that Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell disappeared from their father's plantation in March 1847 along with 2 enslaved men, that they later appeared in the North with new identities and families, and that Catherine briefly returned to Georgia after the Civil War, are supported by strong records. Yet many details remain uncertain, surviving only in diary fragments, letters with missing pages, and fading family memories. Like many stories of resistance to slavery, especially those involving women, the full truth has been hidden by time, by deliberate secrecy, and by a historical record that often failed to preserve the voices of those who broke the rules. In 2002, one final important discovery added another layer to the story. During renovations of a former boarding house in Philadelphia that once sheltered many Underground Railroad fugitives, workers found a small space in a chimney containing a cloth pouch. Inside was a gold locket with tiny portraits believed to be of the Caldwell twins as young women, along with a folded paper marked with the words Elizabeth and Catherine, Georgia, 1844. Experts believe Catherine may have hidden the locket before her return to Georgia in 1865, possibly as protection in case she did not return. If so, the locket is a powerful reminder of the danger she still faced, even after slavery had legally ended, when confronting her past. The portraits show 2 young women with matching heart-shaped faces and serious expressions, dressed in the style of privileged Southern belles of the 1840s. Nothing in these ordinary images hints at the extraordinary choices they would make just 3 years later. Those choices would lead them to leave behind the world shown in the portraits and to accept lives they could hardly have imagined when the pictures were taken. Today, the descendants of the Caldwell twins, of Samuel and Elijah, live across the United States, many unaware of their connection to this story. Those who do know often speak of the complex legacy it carries, of moral courage, but also of the difficult truth that the Caldwell twins were both beneficiaries of and rebels against a deeply unjust system. The former Caldwell plantation land has been reshaped by time and development, with suburban houses now standing where cotton once grew. The small historical marker, faded by years of sun and rain, gives no hint of the human drama that unfolded there. Visitors would never guess that this quiet place was once the setting for an extraordinary act of defiance against one of the strongest social systems of its time. Perhaps that invisibility is appropriate. At its heart, the story of the Caldwell twins is about unseen connections between people across artificial boundaries. It is about quiet acts of rebellion that often go unrecorded. It is about the courage to imagine a different life than the one society demands. In her final diary entry before their escape, Catherine Caldwell wrote, "Tomorrow we step into darkness, not knowing if we will find light on the other side. But even the darkness of uncertainty is better than the false brightness of a life built on others' suffering. Whatever comes, we have chosen our path freely, perhaps the first truly free choice of our lives. That choice, Made on a March night in 1847 by two privileged young women and two enslaved men, continues to echo through time. It stands as a reminder of the power of individual conscience against overwhelming social pressure, and of the human ability to awaken morally even in the most unlikely places. The sound of that echo grows softer with each passing year, as those who remember the story pass away, as documents fade, and as the physical traces of the Caldwell plantation disappear into Georgia's soil. Yet the story remains, a quiet voice from the past that still has the power to disturb and inspire. It challenges us to look at our own lives, our own compromises, and our own courage, or lack of it, when faced with injustice. In this way, perhaps the story of the Caldwell twins is not only about the past, but also about the present and the future, about the choices we make, the limits we accept or reject, and the kind of world we choose to build or maintain. Their legacy lives not in monuments, but in the continuing human struggle to recognize and honor the humanity in ourselves and in others, whatever the cost. And so the story ends where it began, with four young people stepping into the darkness of a Georgia night, leaving behind everything they knew for the uncertain promise of freedom. We now know they found their way to that freedom, imperfect though it was. What we can never fully know is the courage it took to take that first step, to turn away from the only world they had ever known, to choose an uncertain future over a compromised present. In that moment of choice lies the heart of their story. A moment that still reaches across time, asking us what we might be willing to risk for love, for justice, and for the chance to live by our deepest values rather than by the expectations of others. It is a question without an easy answer, but one worth asking again and again as we move through our own darkness, searching for light.